A cry for help in the dead of night. The suffocating quiet of dorm room 312 at the United States National Military University was shattered just after midnight. A single guttural scream pierced the darkness. Jason Lee's voice, raw with terror and pain, reverberated down the linoleum-tiled corridor, echoing off the locked doors of other sleeping cadets. To anyone awake, it would have been unmistakably a cry for help, for mercy, maybe even a last desperate plea for someone to intervene. But that night, the walls of room 312 kept their secrets, and fear held every tongue in place. Jason, a sophomore with a reputation for kindness and relentless discipline, had fallen victim to a conspiracy that would drag him through unimaginable torment. As the moon's pale light barely trickled through a barred window, Jason was forcibly pinned to the cold linoleum floor by several towering silhouettes. His fellow cadets, now transformed in the shadows to faceless tormentors. Their hands were rough, relentless. Over his muffled cries, one of them plugged in a steam iron. The glow of its indicator light, the only brightness in the room, cast an eerie shimmer as it began to heat. The hiss of building pressure, an ominous soundtrack to the horror unfolding. Seconds felt like centuries as Jason struggled in vain. The first press of hot metal against his skin sent a sharp, acrid scent into the air, a sickening combination of scorched flesh and synthetic polyester from his pajama pants. He thrashed, instinctively trying to escape, his cries subsiding to whimpers as shock overtook him. The pain was so bright, so immediate, that time itself seemed to warp and stutter. What had first begun with a chilling accusation and sharp words earlier that day, had metastasized into this. Each cadet in that room, some trembling, some too eager, took turns wielding the iron. They whispered to each other as if performing a dark ritual. In Jason's mind flashed images of family, late-night study sessions, every hope and promise that had once filled the very walls that now witnessed his agony. Jason called out for help again and again, not just for himself, but as if scratching at the very fabric of the universe, desperate that somewhere someone would hear. But outside that door, those who heard his cries did nothing. Some pressed their pillows harder to their ears. Others sat bolt upright in bed, paralyzed by the unspoken code of silence that had calcified within the institution for decades. No one would come, and Jason knew it. In that moment, body racked and soul battered, he was utterly, terribly alone. That night, the sound of Jason's torment did not fade quickly. It drifted into the dreams of the few who dared acknowledge what they'd heard. For Jason, the taste of steel in the air, the lights flickering above, and the cruel laughter of those around him marked the point of no return. A moment stamped in time when the system meant to build heroes, instead, devoured one of its own. United States National Military University, a dream forged in iron discipline. The United States National Military University is more than a school. For generations, it has been hallowed ground for those who aspire to serve, to command, and to belong to something greater than themselves. Nestled behind high, fortified fences in the heart of America, its imposing architecture gleams under the sun, all sharp angles and granite purpose, every stone carrying the weight of history. From afar it almost appears impenetrable, a citadel dedicated to the ideals of honor, duty, and sacrifice. This institution traces its roots back before the First World War, when the country needed officers forged in the fires of both intellect and grit. Over the decades it evolved, becoming the flagship for grooming military leaders across every branch: Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. The university is fiercely selective, its acceptance rate tighter than the grip on a parade rifle. Earning a spot means years of tireless effort, shattered expectations, and relentless self-improvement. For many, just setting foot on campus signifies that one has already won a race most can only imagine completing. Life at the university is a paradoxical mix of privilege and austerity. Students are immersed in a rigorous academic environment. Advanced mathematics, military history, engineering, and leadership studies fill their daylight hours. But the true curriculum is woven into every waking moment. Precision marching at dawn, inspections that would intimidate even the bravest, and a silent promise not to let down the millions represented by the flags fluttering above. Cadets share everything: triumphs, failures, meals in the vast mess hall, sleepless runs under leaden skies, and countless stories of family pride and expectation that echo in the halls at night. Here, discipline is not just a rule, it is a way of breathing. Every action, from the sharp salute to the perfectly made bunk, holds meaning. Violations are not simply mistakes, They are failures of character, scrutinized not only by officers but by peers who have staked their own futures on the code. Bonds are formed in trials by fire, and those who graduate do so as much by the strength of their will as by the brilliance of their minds. To the outside world, the university epitomizes America's ideals: courage, resilience, leadership. Yet beneath the rituals and the prestige, currents of competition, tradition, and pressure run deep. Dreams forged here are often paid for in sweat, tears, and sometimes in the invisible scars of loneliness and fear. For every proud graduation day, for every gleaming medal, there are stories whispered in the hallways. Stories like Jason's that challenge the very purpose and promise on which the university was built. Jason Lee, the good son of an immigrant family. Jason Lee was born on a chilly December morning in 1997, his first cries echoing through the small apartment his family rented in a quiet suburb of Northern Virginia. The Lees, originally from a bustling city in South Korea, had immigrated to the United States in the late 1990s, determined to carve out a better future after hardship and longing for security. Jason's arrival, following the heartbreak of 2 miscarriages, marked a miracle for his parents. A newborn bundle of hope and possibility, his mother's arms trembling with joy and disbelief. From childhood, Jason was the embodiment of the American dreamer, dutiful, kind, and relentlessly hardworking. His parents raised him on stories of sacrifice, perseverance, and the bittersweet ache of missing home, values stitched invisibly into every family meal, every gently spoken lesson at the dinner table. Jason learned to balance 2 worlds, fluent in his parents' native language, yet eager to blend into the mosaic of American life. He brought home straight A's, played chess, and joined the swim team, and always wore the quiet, unassuming smile of someone who was determined to make his family proud above all else. Money was never abundant in the Lee household, but love and hope ran deep. Jason's father worked long hours at a local electronics shop, while his mother juggled part-time jobs and community college classes, so she could one day earn her American nursing degree. Every holiday, the family gathered around a small table covered in homemade dishes, giving thanks for each other and for the hard-won chance to dream bigger. For Jason, every report card and every blue ribbon became a sacred offering to the sacrifices his parents had made, their relentless faith pushing him to reach further, aim higher. By high school, Jason's drive had sharpened into aspiration. He dreamed of the sea, desperate to earn a commission in the Navy and one day command a great ship. He filled out applications to every military academy, pored over textbooks, and ran extra miles long after his classmates had gone home. But the process was grueling, and when he received a rejection letter from the United States Naval Academy, Jason's disappointment was heavy. He didn't let it break him. Instead, he set his sights on the United States National Military University, a place with its own storied traditions and fierce pride. He promised his mother that he'd one day wear an officer's uniform and never make her regret her trust. Jason's relationship with his mother was especially close, forged in quiet conversations about life's risks and rewards. She feared for him, her memories of hardship in a turbulent homeland making her worry about the dangers, both physical and moral, of a military life in a foreign land. Still, seeing the light in her son's eyes, she agreed to let him chase his dream. Before he left, she cautioned him to seek good friends, warning quietly that every soldier she ever knew carried invisible wounds, and some faced even greater battles off the field than on it. At the university, Jason became the sort of cadet instructors remembered fondly: polite, curious, and unwavering in his discipline. He studied late into the night, helped classmates struggling to keep up, and sent regular updates home, never dwelling on hardships, only sharing small triumphs and tales of camaraderie. Yet underneath, Jason felt the pressure of expectation keenly. He knew every struggle, every lonely night, was a debt owed to his family's sacrifices, and decades spent forging a fragile peace in a brand new world. Tragically, those dreams would soon darkest unravel. For Jason, the window of hope he'd so carefully opened would be slammed shut, not by the chaos of battle or the weight of duty, but by a heartbreakingly casual cruelty lurking within the very walls that should have offered safety. Long before that fateful night in room 312, Jason Lee had grown up learning to carry the hopes of a family, the responsibilities of a son, and the burden of proving, again and again, that he truly belonged. No one who knew him would ever forget the promise he carried, or the tragedy of its loss. Pressure and ambition in Jason's heart. Since Jason was a young boy, the weight of dreams, his own and his family's, etched itself into his every thought and action. Having grown up in a household where stories of sacrifice and hope colored every mealtime conversation, Jason felt a duty that often exceeded his years. No one in the Lee family said it outright, but Jason understood that every parent's expectation hung in the air like an unspoken prayer. Succeed, and prove that all the hardships were worth it. In high school, these pressures took on new forms. Not only was Jason challenged by rigorous academic courses that demanded constant vigilance and effort, but every A he received felt like a small repayment toward his parents' struggle. His weekends filled up with study groups, SAT prep, and volunteer activities designed to polish the resume of a future officer. Sometimes, lying awake at night, Jason wrestled with a sense of responsibility so heavy it made his chest ache. If I fail, he would think, what does that say about all that my parents have given up? But there was also the engine of ambition, a blazing desire that for Jason was inseparable from love for his family. He wasn't just living to fulfill a parent's expectation, he genuinely dreamed of wearing the navy blue, standing at the bow of a great ship, saluting the sunrise. He read voraciously about famous commanders and spent countless hours researching the ins and outs of naval strategy and military leadership. While his friends obsessed over sports teams and pop culture, Jason built spreadsheet plans for his future and plotted out every step needed to get into a prestigious academy. When he faced rejection from the United States Naval Academy, the blow was more than academic, it was a test of his spirit. He allowed himself one night to mourn, and the next morning forced himself to lace up his running shoes and hit the trail at dawn. This was more than resilience. It was an unwavering belief that setbacks could be overcome through sheer will. Even after being accepted into the National Military University, Jason's drive didn't falter. If anything, the environment around him presented new rivals, new standards, and new anxieties. Surrounded by some of the country's best and brightest, Jason sometimes wondered if he truly belonged. Imposter syndrome gnawed at him in the quiet moments, but he buried that doubt beneath layers of effort. Endless study sessions, military drills before sunrise, volunteering to help weaker cadets, and keeping a spotless record. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not when the hopes of 2 generations rested on his shoulders. Beneath all of this, an internal struggle brewed. At times, Jason wanted to call his mother and confess how overwhelming it all felt. Yet every time he picked up the phone, he heard the fatigue in her voice or saw the calluses on his father's hands and swallowed those confessions whole. To protect his parents from worry, Jason filtered out the loneliness, competition, and the relentless drive to stay afloat. Outwardly, he was the model cadet, disciplined, polite, and focused. Inwardly, he was locked in a duel between vulnerability and resolve, ambition and anxiety, hope and fear of letting everyone down. Still, for every moment of self-doubt, Jason's ambition won out. He pressed onward, convinced that somewhere beyond the next hurdle was the life and pride his family deserved. It was a dream forged not just in discipline and sacrifice, but in a quiet, persistent hope that adversity itself might be the proving ground for greatness. The first strange signs. It was early 2017 when the fabric of Jason's daily life began to subtly, almost imperceptibly, unravel. At first, the cracks were so faint that even those who knew him best failed to notice. Jason's voice, once bright and lively in every call home, became subdued, weighed down by something he refused to name out loud. In a late February phone call to his mother, his usual cheerful updates about classes and training were missing, replaced with vague assurances that he was just tired and a little under the weather. His mother, always attuned to the smallest shift in her son's tone, felt an unease settle in her chest. She pressed him gently for more detail, offering to visit or send comfort from home, but Jason brushed it off, never wanting to trouble his family with worry. He insisted he couldn't come home for the holidays, because of his health, a reason that sat uncomfortably with his parents who knew his resilience. Family group chats filled with photos and jokes seemed to receive fewer contributions from Jason as the weeks went by. Even his closest friends on campus noted that he spent more time alone, skipping out on late-night study sessions and group meals in the mess hall, instead choosing silence or solitary walks as a companion. Beneath the surface, subtle indicators became much harder to ignore. Jason, a disciplined student who rarely missed a class or training drill, began showing up late or with barely concealed exhaustion in his eyes. There were rumors circulating among the cadets, a whisper network that spoke of tensions in his dorm, or that Jason had rubbed someone the wrong way. He was spotted rubbing at what looked like new bruises beneath his uniform, always chalking them up to athletic mishaps or clumsiness. But the marks grew more noticeable, mapped across his knuckles and forearms like a secret language his body was forced to speak. One evening, a roommate returned early from a study group to find Jason staring at his phone in the dark, tears shining on his face, breath ragged as he tried to compose himself. When asked what was wrong, Jason simply wiped his eyes, forced a tired smile and shrugged. "It's nothing, just stress." What none of them knew was that Jason had already reached out for help, albeit cautiously. He sent a cryptic message to his girlfriend, mentioning he wasn't feeling well lately and something weird was going on. He stopped short of giving specifics, afraid of the consequences for himself and those around him. There were a handful of failed attempts to speak to a school counselor. Each time Jason would lose his nerve at the last minute, terrified that seeking help would only make him a target. Faculty members, often overloaded and distant from the intimate realities of dorm life, failed to connect the dots. A strange note, anonymous, brief, almost pleading, was slid under a staff office door warning of serious trouble in Jason's dorm, but it was quickly dismissed as vague and unsubstantiated. The school's culture, after all, prized stoicism and endurance over vulnerability. In an environment that glorified toughness and demanded silence, the early signals of danger became just more background noise, easy to ignore. For Jason, the first signs of isolation and mistreatment felt like a growing storm, invisible in its approach, yet chilling in its certainty. Each day he woke determined to push through, to take it like a soldier, but the feeling that something was fundamentally terribly wrong lodged itself in his chest and would not leave. The curtain of truth rises. When the faint light of dawn seeped into the sterile corridors of the county hospital, a hush settled over a handful of sleepless nurses and the officers standing guard outside Jason Lee's room. News had spread fast, rippling through the chilly morning air, and finding its way into the pages of local newspapers and the deepening creases of his parents' faces. Now, everything that had been whispered, hidden, and brutally contained behind locked doors was forced into the open by the kind of truth that could not be disguised, denied, or dimmed. Jason's parents arrived in a daze, exhausted and running on an instinctive, gut-wrenching dread. Through the foggy glass window of the hospital ward, Mrs. Lee's trembling hand pressed against the pane as she caught a first look at her son, surrounded by machines and tubes, his figure so altered by injury that she almost didn't recognize him. Her heart pounded not with hope but the agony of a mother who somehow knew, even before the doctors spoke, that loss was imminent and irreversible. Hours blurred together in a series of bureaucratic obstacles, hospital paperwork, guarded answers from medical staff, and uniformed police officers blocking access to her son's bedside, all delayed the moment when Mr. and Mrs. Lee would see Jason face to face. When they were finally allowed inside, Jason's room was heavy with the chemical scent of antiseptic and loss. What had happened to him was written on every part of his twisted, battered body, his hands blistered and misshapen, deep bruises lining his arms and torso, searing burns crusted over in angry red welts. Some wounds were new, while others revealed a long history of pain. The shock was total, so much so that for a full minute, Mrs. Lee could only stand in the doorway, gripping her husband's arm so tightly her fingernails left crescent marks. No parent should ever have to witness what Jason's looked upon that morning. The doctors, with faces grave and voices carefully professional, described the extent of the injuries in sanitized medical terms: second and third degree burns, several fractured ribs, a broken knee, and deep tissue bruising all over. But language seemed wholly inadequate. For Mr. Lee, each clinical description hit with the force of accusation, as if each word meant one more thing he'd failed to protect his only child from. What neither parent could process yet, and what even the most experienced nurse struggled to comprehend, was the cruel deliberateness of the harm. These were not accidents nor the results of some training gone awry. The truth was raw and simple. Jason had been systematically tortured. His injuries followed unnatural patterns. The burns, for example, clearly traced the outline of a household steam iron. Old bruises overlapped with newer marks, evidence of a relentless campaign of brutality waged over weeks, if not longer. As Jason lay in a chemically induced coma, breathing shallowly under the whirring and blinking of medical monitors, detectives began to piece together the grim puzzle of his final days. The investigation started with the obvious physical evidence, but quickly spread to interviews with hospital staff, university officials, fellow cadets, and residents of the dormitory. Slowly, a narrative emerged, a story of suspicion within his unit, escalating pressure from a close-knit group of upperclassmen, and the eerie silence of those who watched but did nothing. Information trickled out reluctantly. Some cadets hid behind practiced stoicism, refusing to admit more than what was absolutely necessary. Others, shaken and guilty, wept openly as they recounted the sounds they'd heard through dorm walls, muffled screams, the repeated thudding of blows, the haunted aftershocks of a young man's pain reverberating at all hours of the night. One by one, the web of silence was torn open, exposing each participant, active or complicit, for who they were. For the Lee family, anguish blurred quickly into outrage. Mrs. Lee, usually soft-spoken and reserved, demanded answers from everyone she could: hospital administrators, detectives, university representatives. She refused to be placated by formal apologies or bureaucratic delays. Mr. Lee, on the other hand, withdrew into a quiet, trembling grief, his sense of failure so immense he could barely look at the world around him. Yet neither parent wavered in their belief that the world needed to understand exactly what had been done to their son, and why it could not simply be swept under the institutional rug. The press seized on the story quickly. Within 48 hours, headlines screaming "Military University Scandal" and "Cadet's Nightmare" ran alongside heartbreaking images of Jason's younger days, a beaming kid in a Little League baseball jersey, the pride of his immigrant parents. Cameras lined the hospital sidewalk, newscasters recounted every grim detail, and social media erupted with the #JusticeForJason hashtag. The country, most of whom had never set foot near a military academy, was suddenly transfixed by the tragedy, a nation forced to stare into the consequences of unchecked cruelty. Law enforcement quickly zeroed in on a core group of individuals who had engineered and enacted the torment. The deeper the investigation dug, the clearer the motivations became, not just the toxic suspicions over a missing laptop, but also underlying currents of jealousy, xenophobia, and the intoxicating sense of power that hierarchy can instill in closed communities. Several students, when pressed, described the old, unspoken codes of conduct that had lingered for decades within the university: handle things internally, show no weakness, and protect the brotherhood no matter what. This culture, one that prized silence as a form of loyalty, meant that even those who were deeply disturbed by Jason's cries felt powerless or too afraid to act. Others had looked for ways to rationalize their inaction, believing it wasn't their place, that the situation would resolve itself, or that any intervention might risk their own futures. Yet, when exposed to the light of public scrutiny, these excuses crumbled. University officials scrambled to contain the fallout, releasing carefully worded statements about their deepest sympathies and determination to cooperate with investigators. Behind the scenes, however, shockwaves ran through every rank. From the president's office to the lowest dormitory advisor, all were forced to confront the enormity of what had slipped through their vaunted traditions and ironclad rules. Emergency meetings were convened, protocols and conduct codes were suddenly reevaluated, albeit much too late for one young cadet. For the Lee family, the most unbearable aspect of the truth was not just the scale of the violence, but the relentlessness of Jason's helplessness. Hospital records showed failed phone calls and text messages Jason had attempted, cries for help couched in coded language, never explicit enough to raise immediate alarm but unmistakable in hindsight. Anonymous letters, slides under staff doors, and offhand remarks to faculty had all been brushed aside, dismissed as complaints or adjustment problems. In the weeks that followed, the Lee home in Virginia filled with visitors, members of the local Korean community, neighbors who had watched Jason grow up, and complete strangers who saw their own children in his story. Piles of sympathy cards, flower bouquets, and homemade food filled the kitchen, a bittersweet testament to how widely Jason's suffering had resonated. Mrs. Lee, while overwhelmed with gratitude, felt a cold emptiness beneath every gesture, knowing that no outpouring of kindness could restore what she had lost. It wasn't just a single tragedy that had unraveled, but an indictment of a broader system, one that demanded strength at any cost, that failed to protect the vulnerable, and that sacrificed the individual for the sake of appearance and tradition. The Lees pressed on not just for justice for their son, but so no other family would endure the same silent catastrophe. With each public revelation, the narrative sharpened. The accident story had been a calculated cover-up, devised at the moment Jason collapsed and could no longer be hidden away. The group responsible, once respected as model students and athletes, were unmasked as perpetrators, facing arrest and the scorn of a nation. Investigators traced acts of intimidation, group messaging threads colluding on what lies to tell, and the cold mechanics of maintaining silence under threat. Court documents later revealed that even as Jason's injuries worsened, the group believed, or desperately hoped, he would pull through, treating his agony as some twisted trial. But the intention, whether to kill or simply teach a lesson, mattered little in the end. What was exposed before the public at last was what Jason could not voice: the cost of being different, the peril of standing alone, and the ease with which cruelty can fester in the shadows where no one dares to look. When Jason's heart stopped for the final time, the truth could no longer be contained. The hospital doors that had so long separated his family from the world now opened on a flood of investigators, politicians, and activists, all desperate to assign blame, or, in some cases, to try and bring healing to a wounded community. The Lees, broken but steadfast, stood at the heart of the storm, not just as grieving parents but as witnesses, refusing to let the curtain of silence fall once again. By the end, the uncovering of Jason Lee's suffering did more than unmask the individuals who hurt him. It forced an entire institution to grapple with its values, to question the wisdom of prioritizing tradition and reputation over real human lives. For Mrs. Lee and her husband, that first glimpse through the fogged glass at the hospital would forever represent a crossing point, a line between before and after that could never be retraced. In telling Jason's story, the curtain would never again be allowed to drop in silence. The cause: bullying under the veil of a curse. From the outside, it would be unthinkable that a group of top-ranked cadets at the National Military University, a place so fiercely tied to honor, could be caught up in something as irrational and violent as mob bullying informed by a superstitious accusation. Yet beneath the polished surface, the story of Jason Lee's suffering began with just that: suspicion, whispered rumors, and the invocation of a so-called curse. It all started with a missing laptop, a piece of technology almost every cadet relied on to succeed. Tensions in the crowded dorm had been running high for weeks, exacerbated by the mounting demands of exams, physical training, and the relentless competition that colored even the most mundane activities. When one evening a prized laptop vanished without a trace from a shared space, an undercurrent of distrust coursed through the group. Unspoken resentments and insecurities found a new focus in the search for someone to blame. Jason's quiet, careful nature had always set him apart. While respected for his work ethic, he didn't always join in on idle banter, nor did he participate in the subtle games of alliance that often formed among dorm mates. It was this perceived distance, his reluctance to fully blend in, that suddenly became suspect in the eyes of a few ambitious upperclassmen. Their discomfort with the outsider flared into open suspicion. Soon, a rumor was seeded. Jason, the quiet son of immigrants, was acting strange right around the time the laptop disappeared. The sense of unease grew quickly, fanned by a spiraling group mentality eager for a scapegoat. It might have stopped at hushed gossip or cold shoulders if not for a fateful, impulsive decision. One member, desperate for answers, called a local psychic, someone whose showy reputation promised uncanny insight and swift judgments. The so-called psychic, hearing only vague details over the phone, issued an unambiguous verdict. "It's someone who always keeps to himself. Look for the one who does not belong." For a group already straining under the pressure of military life, sleep deprivation, and long-held prejudices, this pronouncement landed like gospel. There were no fingerprints, no camera footage, no logical investigation, only the certainty of a supposed supernatural confirmation. Almost overnight, Jason became marked. The accusation, though ridiculous on its face, took on an air of inevitability. Within the insular walls of the dorm, the line between rational conduct and mob thinking blurred. Military training encouraged swift, united action and the unquestioning loyalty of a unit. But here, that cohesion twisted into something feral. The group's pursuit of answers devolved into a hunt, powered by a toxic blend of superstition, tribalism, and pent-up frustration. The curse became a twisted rationale, a way to absolve themselves of personal responsibility. It wasn't about justice anymore. It was about reinforcing the arbitrary boundary between us and the outsider. At first, the bullying presented itself through exclusion and cruel jokes. Jason's possessions were hidden or tampered with, his study materials vandalized, and once friendly faces dissolved into suspicious glares. He was called Jinx and Bad Luck, sometimes directly to his face, other times in whispers that always seemed to float just out of earshot. Whenever Jason protested his innocence, his denials were twisted to further fuel the group's sense of certainty. If he weren't guilty, why would he be so defensive? Why doesn't he fight harder? The situation quickly escalated, unchecked by any meaningful adult intervention. Officers and faculty, immersed in their own bureaucratic routines or unwilling to question the group's veneer of discipline, failed to pick up on the warning signs. Cadet loyalty, especially in tight-knit living quarters, often shrouded even the most alarming behavior in silence. A few students sensed that things were spiraling, but the unspoken rules were clear. Don't betray your unit, or you might be next. In an especially dark twist, the group began talking openly of the curse, as though it had a will of its own, justifying ever harsher actions. If Jason was truly cursed, the only way to protect everyone and to break the spell was by forcing a confession or punishing him. A ritual-like atmosphere developed. Belongings were staged as offerings. Rooms were cleansed after Jason's presence, and late-night councils convened in hushed tones to decide his fate. It's here that the boundary between superstition and sanctioned group discipline shattered completely. No longer content to simply isolate Jason, a handful from the group began orchestrating humiliating interrogations. Under the guise of character testing, Jason was compelled to answer questions for hours, forced into physically stressful positions, deprived of sleep, and made to endure psychological taunts about his background and family. Their methods bore all the trademarks of interrogation, yet lacked any plausible justification or oversight. What made the ordeal even more harrowing was the convergence of old prejudices and modern groupthink. Jason's status as the son of immigrants, already a point of quiet distinction in many people's minds, was weaponized. He was accused of never really fitting in, of being too quiet, too perfect, too suspicious. The psychic's pronouncement became a convenient excuse to vent all underlying distrust and, in some, the envy of Jason's quiet competence. Throughout these torments, Jason still sought ways to clear his name. He pleaded with individual classmates for understanding, wrote respectful notes to resident advisors, and even considered going straight to campus authorities, only to be met with cold warnings about the consequences of making trouble. The group's collective certainty, validated by their own rituals, left no room for doubt. For every cadet who felt uncomfortable, there was the constant fear, breaking rank would make them just as vulnerable. Overlaying all of this was a strange, almost cult-like sense of purpose among Jason's tormentors. This wasn't simply about a missing laptop anymore, it was about maintaining group order, enforcing conformity, and purging supposed weakness from within. The curse transformed from a private anxiety into a weapon for communal punishment. Repeatedly, individuals rationalized their participation or silent complicity. We had to do it for the good of the group. He brought this on himself. Even as Jason's physical and psychological state visibly deteriorated, his eyes hollow, posture tense, and spirit subdued, few dared to confront the threat directly. Some students justified their silence by telling themselves that it was just hazing, or that these things blow over, despite mounting evidence that the situation was spiraling beyond anything the university's fabled discipline could condone. Classic mechanisms of bullying, gaslighting, scapegoating, and the slow erosion of dignity were left unchecked, shielded by the rationalization of breaking a curse. At its core, the tragedy was not created by one decision, but by a series of escalating choices, each made easier by groupthink, traditional deference to authority structures, and a superstitious justification that relieved individuals of their moral responsibilities. It was a modern-day witch hunt, camouflaged in the language of loyalty and protection. Looking back, those who watched from the periphery often remembered haunting moments, anxious glances in the hallway, the stilted silences at mess hall tables, the unmistakable look of fear on Jason's face when approached by larger groups in uniform. A handful of cadets later admitted to nightmares about what they'd witnessed, but never reported. For Jason, every day blurred between dread and desperate hope for intervention, as the lines between right and wrong dissolved in the academy's echoing corridors. By the time the true horror of the bullying became undeniable, the curse had served its purpose. It unified a group in their persecution of the vulnerable, granting every participant the illusion of righteousness. No one thought they would become monsters, but step by step, through misplaced obedience and the comfort of collective action, boundaries were crossed, and another life was irreparably destroyed. What emerged from Jason Lee's ordeal was a chilling portrait of how institutions, when wedded to tradition, pressure, and superstition, can sometimes lose sight of the individuals they are sworn to protect. When reason gives way to myth, and group loyalty blinds people to compassion, tragedies born of whispers and irrational fears can grow into calamities no one can later claim to have intended or to have stopped. Torture scenes in modern United States. In the institutional heart of a country that prided itself on justice and progress, the very idea that torture, raw, methodical, and stripped of pretense, could unfold in the shadowy corners of a military academy felt impossible to most. Yet what Jason Lee suffered within those dormitory walls was not a relic of ancient cruelty, but an evolving, contemporary manifestation of group violence and dehumanization. The facade of order, discipline, and brotherhood hid a nightmare where the American promise of safety unraveled, thread by thread. The acts of torment inflicted on Jason didn't erupt overnight. They invaded the rhythm of daily life slowly, at first indistinguishable from the harshness often romanticized in elite training environments. Like so many forms of modern hazing, the group disguised escalating abuse as character building or toughening up. Common objects in the dorm became tools of pain, a cracked belt for whipping, coat hangers twisted for binding, a steam iron pressed to skin until flesh blistered and cracked. The brutality was choreographed with a disturbing sense of routine. Punishments were meted out methodically, driven less by rage than by a cold sense of procedural duty. It began in whispers and dares, a whispered consensus rooted in supposed necessity. "If he makes it through this," one ringleader muttered, "he'll finally belong, or he'll break." The boundary between a twisted sense of teaching and outright cruelty was breached so subtly that, at first, even the perpetrators rationalized their actions as somehow justifiable within the group's unwritten rulebook. Every new escalation cemented the group's power and eroded Jason's sense of self. Isolation bred compliance, and compliance bred further risk. Unlike the fleeting suffering of playground bullying, Jason's ordeal thrived under the cover of structure and authority. Group members rotated shifts, each taking part in the ritual and each performing their brutality with disconcerting precision. The steam iron sizzle became a symbol in their perverse language, a threat used to quiet resistance. "Stay down or it gets worse." Every burn marked Jason's body, and more chilling marked his mind. Sleep deprivation, forced confessions, and exposure to humiliating acts followed, all justified with grim assurances that, somehow, endurance was proof of worthiness. This pattern wasn't random chaos, it reflected a dark convergence of psychology and institutional failure. Some group members, terrified of being ostracized in the same way as Jason, participated in the violence out of self-preservation. Others clung to the notion that their actions were simply the way things had always been done, a tradition that predated them and thus, in their minds, required obedience above conscience. In this modern American institution, old traditions mingled with new pressures: perform, conform, and never show weakness. And somewhere in that tangled web, the line between training and torment evaporated completely. Those who didn't directly participate still became part of the machine. Silence and inaction were the grease that kept wheels turning. Some cadets pressed headphones to their ears or turned up music when Jason's cries echoed through thin dormitory walls. Others left the building during the worst of it, telling themselves it was better not to know. The rarity of a bystander brave enough to attempt intervention was telling. When one did, it was in the anonymous cowardice of a note pushed under a faculty door. Too vague, too late. The physical suffering Jason endured was monstrous, but so too was the psychological torture. His tormentors severed ties to the outside world, confiscating his phone under the pretense of security. They manipulated his social connections, spreading rumors about mental instability or fabricated misconduct. In private, Jason's world shrank to the fear-stricken limits of his own mind. He counted bruises, kept track of when the iron would likely return, tried to imagine escape plans that never materialized. The progressive unraveling of his spirit became, in the twisted logic of the group, further evidence of his guilt and difference. Meanwhile, the institution remained willfully blind. The few warning signs that pierced the bureaucratic haze, occasional absences, faltering grades, a troublemaker label whispered among staff, were filed away, explained away, or ignored outright. The presence of cameras in hallways did little to deter calculated abuse. The violence always took place strategically, in the blind spots. Supervising officers, either overburdened or caught in their own cycles of conformity, never pieced together the mosaic of warning signs that, in hindsight, were glaring. And yet, in the context of modern America, it was precisely this facade, that these things couldn't happen here, which nurtured the silence. Pop culture and institutional legend said, American academies are tough, but they don't cross real lines. Rules exist to protect the weak. As a result, when students and staff witnessed cracks, their denial was ready-made. Surely nothing so medieval, so unspeakable could be taking place within their revered institution. That denial was Jason's final prison. Even among torture's architects, the perverse camaraderie splintered as Jason's health visibly declined. Some grew uneasy and began to distance themselves, silent witnesses to a crime they'd never anticipated would reach its gruesome climax. Others doubled down, worried that stopping would mean exposure and punishment for all. The group's logic was a hall of mirrors. Each act made the next seem inevitable. Each member's complicity bred more complicity. When Jason could no longer stand, could barely eat, and spoke only in monosyllables or not at all, the ringleaders finally realized that their control had become a death sentence. It was only when Jason collapsed, body racked by infection and trauma, that the locked dorm doors finally opened. The facade of modern America, one that believed it had outgrown such barbarities, crumbled with frightening speed. Staff, medics, and investigators flooded into the stifling, echoing rooms, and the truth they uncovered left a scar across the institution and the national consciousness alike. For all of its illusions of enlightenment, modern America was forced to confront the ancient darkness that can thrive even now behind locked doors and sealed lips. The vocabulary of torture, dehumanization, groupthink, rationalization remains the same as it has through centuries. In Jason Lee's story, it wore the uniform of patriotism and discipline, but underneath, it was unchanged, a test of who we become in the absence of courage and compassion. 2 weeks of hell, cries for help, ignored. Jason Lee's final 2 weeks at the academy unfolded like a slow-motion tragedy, each day more punishing, more isolated, and more hopeless than the last. What began as anxiety and exhaustion spiraled into a living nightmare, one where every attempt to escape or seek help was systematically crushed. In this chilling interval, the full weight of indifference, both institutional and personal, revealed itself through the indelible marks on his body and piercing silence around his suffering. In the early days of his torment, Jason still clung to hope. Maybe a trusted figure would notice the change, the bags under his eyes, his declining performance, or the visible bruises he tried to cover with long sleeves and forced smiles. He rehearsed what he would say if someone truly asked, "Are you okay?" He crafted partial confessions in his mind for counselors, resident advisors, and even his closest friends. But the words always caught in his throat, part pride, part fear, of not being believed, of being labeled weak, of facing harsher retaliation. The threat from his tormentors was explicit. If you say anything, it only gets worse. There were moments, fleeting but searing, when Jason reached for connection. He texted his girlfriend vague hints about being unwell, his messages heavy with unsaid longing for someone to read between the lines. She noticed the sudden change in tone, his evasiveness, the way he brushed off her concern. Each conversation ended with reassurances Jason didn't believe himself. "I'm just tired. There's a lot going on," he'd say. To his family, the distance was sharper. Jason, always meticulous with his words, started responding to group messages with generic thumbs up or not at all. He attempted to write a letter to a guidance counselor, his handwriting shaky, words chosen carefully so as not to trigger suspicion if intercepted. This letter, a desperate act, never reached its intended recipient. It was found and shredded by one of the very tormentors he was trying to expose. The group's surveillance was absolute. Someone always seemed to know when he tried to slip away to make a call, or when he veered close to a faculty office. The more he tried, the more trapped he became. Within the dorm, the walls themselves seemed complicit. Noise echoed, yet no one responded, not truly. The unspoken rule, the Brotherhood's code, demanded loyalty even to wrongdoing. Those who did hear Jason's muffled cries or witnessed his staggering gait rationalized their inaction. "It's just hazing. He'll get through it like everyone else. If he needed real help, he'd ask louder." But Jason did ask, in the subtlest, most desperate ways he knew, lingering at doors, pausing beside staff, hoping someone would see past his stoic mask and intervene. Nighttime was the worst. Beneath the thin navy blanket, bruises throbbing, Jason rehearsed escape fantasies. Some nights he planned to run from his dorm to call emergency numbers and finally admit everything, but fear of exposure, humiliation, and never being able to return home in pride held him back. One night, whispers from his aggressors pierced the silence. "No one cares! No one's coming!" they taunted. And for Jason, it began to feel true. Sleep deprivation soon became another tool wielded against him. They forced him awake with sudden light, subjected him to rounds of humiliating tasks, and berated him for imagined mistakes. Even when Jason was too exhausted to cry, his mind raced with the hope, maybe tomorrow will be different. But the violence only escalated. Any show of defiance, avoiding eye contact, hesitating at a command, provoked harsher discipline. As days blurred, Jason's perception warped. Monotone lectures in class became background noise. His world narrowed to the dim dorm lights, the sting of wounds, and the ever-present sense of surveillance. Every missed meal, every ignored appointment chipped away at his body and spirit. Friends drifted away, unsure of how to reach someone who seemed both present and unreachable. Faculty marked attendance slips and passed Jason in the hallway without a second look, his silence feeding their belief that nothing was wrong. By the second week, Jason's attempts at resistance faded into numbed compliance. The group's tactics shifted from overt violence to psychological torment. They mocked his accent, his family, his solitary habits. Rumors about his mental instability and bad attitude circulated, making would-be allies doubt his credibility. Any small act of kindness, shouting down a bully, offering an encouraging word, was quickly quashed by peer pressure. No one wanted to be next. Jason became a living lesson in what happened to those who didn't fit the mold. His lifeline, the outside world, grew faint. Every time Jason considered reaching out one last time, his tormentors found ways to undermine his courage. They rerouted his calls, stole his phone, even threatened that snitches would be blacklisted across the academy's tightly knit alumni network. His sense of self, built over years of discipline and hope, eroded a bit more each day. One night, alone and battered, Jason whispered a barely audible plea for help into the darkness, fully aware it would be swallowed by the silence. All the while, evidence mounted in subtle ways: bloodstains on a pillow, notebooks filled with shaky handwriting, bruises too consistent to be accidental. Still, no official action was taken. The environment enabled denial. Supervisors cited lack of concrete proof, and students fallen under groupthink minimized or rationalized away every alarm. In these 2 weeks, Jason endured an unyielding cycle of violence, isolation, and crushed hope. At its core, it wasn't just individual cruelty, but the quiet, collective indifference of a system that preferred to turn away. His suffering stretched far beyond the physical. It was the pain of invisibility, of shouting into a void and discovering that, no matter how urgent the message, sometimes no one is willing to listen. By the time the powers that be finally took notice, the damage, deep, permanent, had already been done. A tearful conclusion and social outrage. After the tragedy reached its irreversible climax, the nation was left struggling to comprehend the consequences of what had transpired behind the closed doors of the academy. Jason's collapse wasn't an isolated event. It was the moment years of systematic neglect, silence, and indifference burst into the open, demanding attention from every corner of American society. The details were broadcast on every major news outlet: a promising young cadet, the son of immigrants, subjected to weeks of unthinkable cruelty by his own peers, while teachers and administrators failed to protect him. The initial aftermath was chaos veiled in official statements and trembling denial. Hospital corridors swelled with law enforcement, reporters, and tearful family members. Jason's parents, overcome by pain and disbelief, answered questions from authorities as images of their son, pale, ravaged, and patched with medical equipment, flashed across the television screens of a horrified nation. Social media exploded with the news. #Justice for Jason trended worldwide, with tens of thousands voicing their outrage and solidarity. Vigils were organized under the cold glow of candles on university campuses, military outposts, and church lawns, each one a small testament to communal grief and growing anger. As the investigation deepened, shocking layers of the story emerged. Testimony revealed not just the violence Jason suffered but also the failures woven into every level of the institution. Local law enforcement, academics, administrators, and even the highest levels of military leadership were forced into the spotlight, no longer able to hide behind abstractions of protocol or tradition. The culture of silence, the preference for handling things within the brotherhood, and the institutional impulse to downplay problems rather than face them directly, were all on trial now. The university held emergency assemblies, but the words of the chancellor, offering deep regrets and promises of reform, felt hollow in the shadow of such enormous loss. For Jason's family, the agony was compounded by the sense that the system itself had betrayed them. Mrs. Lee, her grief-forging courage she never knew she had, gave heart-wrenching interviews to anyone who would listen. She described her son's dreams, his discipline, his longing to serve a country that now seemed not to have returned his love. Her words, sometimes trembling, sometimes steel-edged, cut through political doublespeak, forcing the nation to confront the real human cost of endemic brutality. Community leaders and activists joined her, demanding not just justice in this case, but a national reckoning with bullying, hazing, and systemic indifference masquerading as discipline. The response from students and alumni was divided. Some were quick to distance themselves, insisting that such horrors were aberrations rather than a reflection of military culture. Others, shaken by old memories of similar abuses or long-standing resentments, revealed stories of their own, fueling a flood of whistleblower testimonies and exposés. Petitions, protests, and calls for resignations rippled outward from the university, igniting nationwide conversations about honor, belonging, and the price paid for silence. Institutional review boards and government agencies launched sweeping investigations. Congressional hearings were scheduled, subpoenas flew. Mila, Jason's former roommate, sat anonymous before a panel, voice barely above a whisper as she described the coldness she saw in the dorm. The glances, the warnings not to intervene, the moments she wished she had done more. Boards of trustees resigned. The university president appeared in front of a national audience, her voice strained as she acknowledged that too much trust had been placed in tradition and too little in the simple duty of care. In the broader public, the case became a symbol of the fracture lines running beneath the American promise. Parents watched in horror, questioning the safety of every institution charged with caring for their children. Commentators and editorialists dissected the event, blaming everything from toxic masculinity to outdated codes of conduct, to the hollowing out of empathy in the quest for excellence. For the Lee family, waves of support alternated with bitter reminders that justice, no matter how loud, could not restore what was lost. The funeral, held beneath an unseasonably gray sky, drew crowds so large they spilled out behind the chapel and into the streets. Cadets in pressed uniforms, community leaders, veterans, and strangers united in their shared sense of loss and responsibility. Jason's mother stood at the podium, voice unwavering as she read from his childhood diary, her words echoing promises that now belonged to memory alone. Yet even amid mourning, the nation's rage simmered. Demands for change extended far beyond singular punishment. Lawsuits were filed against the university, faculty, and individual perpetrators. Politicians called for drastic reforms in mental health resources, hazing prevention programs, and transparency requirements for all educational institutions. A national commission was impaneled to investigate not only the culture at the academy, but also the structures that allowed similar tragedies to go unreported. Media outlets continued to revisit the case long after the headlines faded. Documentaries were made. Panel discussions brought together ethicists, survivors, and military historians to grapple with the paradoxes inherent in systems designed to produce heroes, yet all too capable of excusing cruelty. The #Justice for Jason movement expanded its focus, advocating for the rights of all students and cadets to be free from violence and neglect, regardless of the institution they served. Jason Lee's story, shattering in its detail and scope, forced an entire nation to ask itself uncomfortable questions. What is the difference between tradition and abuse? How many warning signs are required before someone is compelled to act? And, most hauntingly, how many more voices need to go unheard before the systems built to protect truly begin to change? In the end, the tears and rage of a community laid bare the failures of an institution and the cost of collective inaction. For the Lees, the only solace was in the hope that telling Jason's story, refusing to let it be hidden or diluted, might one day save another child from the same fate. For the country, the tragedy was a somber call to confront old shadows and finally bring them into the light, into trial hearing and intense debate. The trial that followed Jason Lee's tragedy became one of the most closely watched legal battles in recent American memory, drawing national scrutiny not only because of the brutal nature of the crime, but also because of what it revealed about dark undercurrents in prestigious institutions. Long before the official proceedings began, public opinion was already in turmoil. The nation had wept for Jason, marched in vigils, and decried the culture of silence in military schools. Now America demanded justice, and the courtroom became the crucible where hope, grief, and outrage clashed. From the first day, the courthouse steps were a stage, a constant backdrop of news trucks, protesters, and candle-lit memorials. The Lee family, flanked by supporters and attorneys, arrived to a gauntlet of cameras and sympathetic faces. Their expressions were solemn, Mrs. Lee's eyes sunken but defiant, Mr. Lee never letting go of her hand. They said little to the press, saving their voices for court, where their pain would be a living witness to the consequences of cruelty. The defendants numbered 6 principal accused, upperclassmen and self-proclaimed leaders in the Cadet Corps, plus a dozen others charged as accessories to various degrees. Their legal teams coordinated a defense that tried to diffuse responsibility, painting their actions as groupthink gone awry, a Rashomon tangle of conflicting memories and, at worst, unintended consequences of institutional pressure. Initial statements from the accused reflected this mentality. One insisted, "No one meant for this to happen," while another whispered, "I was just trying to follow orders." The prosecution, however, was relentless. They painstakingly laid out the case. Charts of Jason's injuries, witness testimonies from shell-shocked cadets and digital records, text messages, group chats showing malicious collusion. The gallery heard the chilling recordings of late-night abuses, the haunting pleas for help from Jason, and the callous laughter of his tormentors. Prosecutors argued that this was far more than youthful impulsiveness or a misguided disciplinary episode. Instead, it was methodical, sustained torture, premeditated by a group convinced of its own impunity. Jurors saw photos of the dorm, the iron, the makeshift restraints. Specialists testified about the psychological mechanisms that led good boys to become monsters in the right or wrong conditions. The heart of the trial, however, pulsed in the direct testimonies. Jason's friends broke down as they recounted the days leading up to his hospitalization, his withdrawn demeanor, the times he tried to signal distress, the shame they now carried for not having intervened. A resident advisor admitted to ignoring an anonymous warning, believing boys will be boys, a phrase that drew audible gasps from the gallery. The most damning testimony came from within the group itself. A sophomore, racked by guilt, ultimately detailed the rituals, the cruelty, and the silence, accepting his own culpability. "We thought we were protecting our brotherhood. All we did was destroy a life." Jason's family took the stand on the 4th day. Mrs. Lee, composed yet trembling, described her son's childhood dream, his struggles as a first-generation immigrant, and the harrowing moment she saw her boy, unrecognizable, battered, through the hospital glass. Her testimony was a clarion call for accountability, her grief bringing even hardened journalists to tears. The courtroom sat in stilled silence as Jason's diary entries were read aloud, his hopes and fears now haunting reminders of what had been stolen. Defense attorneys pushed for mitigation. They invoked institutional traditions, hazing rituals, unspoken codes about loyalty and toughness, arguing that the academy itself bore responsibility for fostering a culture where such violence could breed. Several experts in adolescent development and group dynamics took the stand, warning of how power and hierarchy warp judgment under stress. These young men were products of a broken system, one argued. Their individual guilt is real, but so is the culpability of the institution that failed them and Jason alike. Such statements only further fueled the debate. Advocates for Jason's family insisted that personal morality cannot be dissolved by the presence of a group or tradition. Civil rights leaders and immigrant organizations also crowded the courtroom, their presence a visual rebuke to the attempts to minimize the crime. Tempers flared as online forums and cable news hosts turned each development into a national referendum on justice, race, and American values. Outside, public demonstrations raged day and night. Some protesters demanded the harshest sentences the law allowed, holding signs that read, "No more silence," and "Justice for Jason means justice for all." Others, human rights advocates, religious leaders, begged for mercy, arguing that even those who lost their way deserved the possibility of redemption, not vengeance. Petitions circulated, opinion columns published daily. The case turned into a proxy battle for the heart of American justice, retribution or reform. Media scrutiny was relentless. Nightly news shows debated whether the court should set an example that no one, no matter how promising or privileged, was above the law. Pundits dissected the failures at every level, the dorm, the faculty, the systemic pressures, and the national appetite for discipline that sometimes becomes cruelty. Social media saw an outpouring of stories from others in similar institutions, revealing Jason was far from the only victim of such rituals. #Break the Cycle trended beside #Justice for Jason. After weeks of excruciating testimony, closing arguments cut to the bone. The prosecution, standing before a wall of evidence, challenged the jury to look past every excuse and recognize a fundamental truth. Without accountability, this will happen again. Without justice, every child in every dorm is at risk. The defense, desperate and emotional, pleaded with the jury to remember the age, pressures, and lost potential of the accused. We are not just deciding on punishment, we are deciding who we are as a society. Jury deliberations were long and anguished. Reports filtered out about heated debate. Some jurors wanted life without parole. Others believed the death penalty necessary to deter future atrocities. In the end, guilty verdicts landed on all 6 principal defendants, with varying degrees of culpability for the others. Sentencing was a spectacle. While some judges delivered the maximum allowed by law, the debate over capital punishment roiled. The lead prosecutor explained, "We are not punishing monsters. We are punishing lost men who became monstrous." The verdict did not bring true closure. Instead, it opened a new front in the national conversation. Civil liberties groups condemned the harshest sentences, advocating rehabilitation and apology over execution. Many believed the outcome ignored deeper institutional failings. Hearings were scheduled for university leadership and Department of Defense officials. Lawmakers drafted bills requiring independent oversight for all military academies and anti-hazing reforms. Scholars and commentators produced think pieces on group psychology, warning how easily good intentions can warp into groupthink and cruelty. But for the Lee family, the outcome was both a balm and a wound. They stood together at the microphone on the final day, Mrs. Lee reading from Jason's last letter home. "Tell Mom I love her." Her voice broke, but her words thundered through the halls. "If this is justice, let it be a beginning, not the end. May no parent suffer what we did. May every institution remember, compassion is not weakness, it is the only strength that endures." The gavel fell, debate raged, but Jason's story, now the nation's, lingered as a permanent lesson in the hard, necessary work of making justice real. The alarm bell of violence and indifference. In the aftermath of the trial and the national reckoning it provoked, the story of Jason Lee transcended the particulars of one boy, one family, or one institution. It echoed as a devastating warning bell, a glaring signal that violence and apathy do not simply reside in isolated corners, they can be deeply woven into the very fabric of modern American society. While the courtroom battles settled into history and the perpetrators faded into the penal system, the ripples coursed outward, challenging millions to examine not just what happened, but why, and what it means for the future. The first and most jarring impact of Jason's story was the forced confrontation with the hidden epidemic of violence among youth. Not just physical, but psychological and systemic. The brutality he endured had roots in long-standing patterns of hazing, bullying, and toxic group loyalty, all legitimized by a culture that sometimes prized toughness and conformity over compassion or individuality. For every headline-grabbing tragedy, countless smaller episodes unfolded in silence. Students mocked for being different, social ostracization turned to ritual punishment, and young people sinking under the weight of expectations and unspoken codes. Jason's ordeal brought these realities out into the harsh daylight, making denial impossible. Perhaps even more chilling was the portrait of institutional failure and collective bystander effect that emerged. The United States, a country founded on promises of opportunity, equality, and justice, was forced to reckon with the consequences of its own revered systems falling short when it mattered most. Teachers, administrators, fellow students, and even broader communities were implicated, not always by direct involvement, but by complicit silence, the convenient rationalization that someone else will step in, or the misplaced confidence that the system left to itself will protect the vulnerable. Within the academy, long-standing traditions and hierarchies became shields that justified non-intervention. The preference for handling matters internally, the glorification of toughness, and the fear of disrupting an institution's reputation all conspired to mute calls for help. In homes across America, parents watched the news with growing anxiety, wondering whether their own children's problems might be similarly ignored or glossed over. Groups tasked with oversight, boards, review committees, even government agencies, realized how easily procedures could be paper shields when human empathy was absent. Jason Lee's case thus forced a profound re-examination of the crisis of empathy, a deficit as dangerous as any physical violence. This was visible not just in the perpetrators, but in every missed opportunity for connection, every look away, every institutional memo that emphasized legal compliance over genuine care. It exposed the limitations of policies and procedures that, without the fire of conscience behind them, often devolved into easy bureaucracy. Real safety, the story warned, cannot be legislated into existence. It must be actively protected by people willing to risk their own comfort for someone else's humanity. As the story spread, the tension between progress and tradition in the American experience became stark. If the nation prided itself on fairness, why did long-standing codes of silence and pseudo-masculine toughness hold so much sway? If diversity and individual worth were bedrock values, why had an outsider, driven, disciplined, but different, been left so exposed? Editorial boards, comment sections, and campus forums buzzed with soul-searching debates about race and belonging, about discipline and abuse, about the thin line between resilience and cruelty. In the weeks and months that followed, Jason's name became a rallying cry in efforts to confront school violence and emotional neglect across the country. Legislation was proposed, stricter anti-bullying statutes, mandated outside oversight of disciplinary procedures, anonymous whistleblower hotlines, and compulsory empathy and ethics training for educators and students alike. High-profile lawsuits threatened the financial and reputational standing of not just the academy involved, but peer institutions nationwide. Social media movements, echoing #Justice for Jason, galvanized survivors of similar abuses to share their stories, sometimes for the first time. More importantly, families, teachers, and students began to talk more openly about empathy and responsibility. In classrooms and homes, questions surfaced. Would you notice if someone nearby was being hurt? Would you act? What does it really mean to stand up to bear witness when silence is the easy route? Town halls and school boards held forums not only in response to Jason's case, but to address echoes of its underlying tragedy in their own backyards. Yet, beneath the surface, the solutions proved as challenging as the diagnosis. While anger burned hot in the immediate aftermath, translating outrage into lasting reform required confronting the comfort of denial and the inertia of long-standing practices. Institutions pledged change, but the culture of silence and group conformity moved slowly, if at all. In some quarters there was backlash, accusations of overreach, lamentations about softness, undermining discipline, or fear that the pendulum would swing too far and erode the core values of resilience and unity. Some argued, not without reason, that rules alone could not prevent tragedy. What must shift is the underlying culture, the courage to speak out, a redefining of loyalty that puts people above reputations, and a new standard for leadership that rewards both strength and kindness. Even among sincere reformers there was tension between punitive responses and rehabilitation, between justice for the bereaved and the possibility of redemption for young people led astray by collective error. Amid these complexities, the Lee family emerged as advocates, pushing not just for justice, but for a broader awakening. In interviews and at public events, they spoke less about retribution than about remembrance and transformation. Mrs. Lee's message, echoed in vigils and awareness campaigns, was unadorned yet radical. Empathy is survival, compassion is strength. Let what happened to our son teach you courage, the courage to care, even when nobody else does. Jason's name became more than a hashtag. It became the impetus for a reckoning within every institution that serves the young and the vulnerable. Serious self-examination swept through other elite programs, military academies, sports teams, private schools, forcing leaders to question past behaviors and future standards. National conversations around masculinity, race, immigrant identity, and belonging deepened, with Jason's memory as a solemn touchstone. Looking back, the tragedy did not fracture America. Rather, it exposed the cracks that had always run beneath its surface, challenging the country to live up to its own narrative of inclusion, value, and care. The warning bell that tolled in the wake of Jason Lee's suffering is not easily silenced. It resounds in every deliberation over policy, every effort to speak truth to power, every act of kindness that risks discomfort for the sake of another's dignity. It urges a clear-eyed appraisal of what we reward and suppress, of who is protected and who is left outside the circle. For those who listened, for whom Jason's fate became a call to action, the lesson remains. The cost of violence is not just in bruises and broken futures, but in the hollow places left when empathy is lost. True security comes not from locked doors or ironclad rules, but from communities where the vulnerable can count on the brave, not just to fight, but to care. In that call, America finds not only its warning, but its hope.